Let alone public speaking. Speaking to anybody that you don't know can be terrifying. And there are ways to reduce how much of a fear you have against speaking to somebody. And that's to prepare for the conversation, right? I prepared like a normal millennial by printing out the stuff that I want to say. And so when you're having any conversation, the very highly recommended preparation to do is to know who you're talking to and know what they want and know what you want from them, right? So that's the topic of today, how to be prepared for the conversation with platform. So why is this even a topic? So when you look at indie game industry, it is very personally and also very strongly woven community, right? When you look at especially Twitter sphere or any online sphere, there's a lot of celebrity devs and publishers sharing their thoughts and opinions and experiences. And that really constructs an ecosystem of how indie game industry works. So how you have to talk to the publishers as a developer, and then how it is recommended to do. But there is some sort of a linking page there. So I personally always feel like there's relatively smaller voice from the platform people. There can be many reasons why, like it is a lot more corporate entity, for example, that has more bigger branding than just a person who is speaking up. And that's why there is some sort of a lack of communal knowledge on how devs or publishers can speak to the platform people, and also like what kind of general process that they can go through. And that kind of creates this awkward silence in the introduction, and also a lot of miscommunication as well. And this can be very daunting, especially for those people who has no experience, who has no direct experience of publishing their game. And when you're self-publishing, you should be ready for that, like practically. And also, even if you're not self-publishing, you're going through publisher, you should know how your baby goes through those kind of process in order to arrive in front of the consumers. So that's why this topic matters. Even though Ramon already introduced me to you guys, I would like to introduce myself once again. So my Twitter profile pretty explains myself pretty accurately. I love watching anime. I'm a gamer. I'm also a South Korean person living in the Netherlands. But I would like to add 2 more points. I have an academic background in new media and digital culture. I used to do research on digital entertainment and their ecosystem. I once got banned from Twitter for scraping data from them. And this is a new account. Anyway, and that kind of academic interest led me to have a career as a stroopwafel deliverer. Half joke, half truth. I am actually a partner manager at Utomik, which means, as Ramon explained already, I go to events, I talk to developers and publishers, and then do the contract negotiation, and also do all the coordination talk about PR and technical integrations. Sorry. I have to breathe. I have to really remember how to breathe. To make sure how the games arrives in the platform in its best form as possible. So my day is very full of conversations with developers and publishers, and I would like to share that kind of experience in more well laid out form today's talk. So before going any deeper, I would like to acknowledge one big fact, is that platforms are very different to each other. Depending on their target audience or audience size or portfolio growth strategy, the platforms, they have a very separate and different priorities and strategies and protocols and how they talk to developers and publishers. As a quick example, I brought these 6 different PC platforms and then laid them out with how strict their curation is, and then how much of an active conversation you have to expect when you're talking to those platforms. So it is actually very simple. Normally, depending on how much of a portfolio growth they show periodically, so like how much of a newly released games there is more attention to, Did that make sense? No. So basically, depending on how much of a portfolio growth that they show, like the smaller it is, there is more attention to one and each games that they're releasing, because they are like smaller pool of games. Like for example, if you have like 3 to 4 games that you're newly releasing, that you want to put more PR and marketing efforts on one in each games, and then that's a stronger identity as a platform. So that means you will have a lot more extensive conversation with the platform for PR and marketing as it goes on. So even with just 2 criteria, you can tell that the platforms are very different from each other. So I would like to say it's like buying a computer. So for some people, like a tablet kind of laptop that is super lightweight, you only do like word work, there is a perfect laptop or perfect computer. And for somebody who has a lot of gaming hobby, then like it is more suitable for you to buy a like big monstrous gaming computer that has great graphic cards and then like great memories and stuff like that, right? So there's no right answer for everyone. There is a right answer for you. So when you're preparing for this kind of purchase, what do you do? So you make a checklist, right? You make a checklist of what price range you want, what kind of memory you want, what kind of graphic cards you want, right? So this talk will be about making those checklists, but for platforms. As every computer has their own specs, the platforms also have their own priority, their own perks, and their own protocols of working. And it is really important to know what's going to happen in the conversation so that you can be prepared to answer those. So this is the checklist that I think is the checklist that I would like to cover today. So it is not fully comprehensive list. There are a lot more topics that you can add in there, but I chose that are hot topic of the days, also the things that are easily neglected, but also really important to consider. So this is very millennial, right? You know, like a hand-printed like notes. There's even highlighters on it. Anyway, so let's move on. Things to consider as a preparation for platform conversation. Number 1 is exclusivity. It's like such a hot topic of the days. I guess that you always you have heard at least once, twice, or all the time, probably. But exclusivity is rather an umbrella term, I think. So there are a lot of stages and types of exclusivity that you can choose from, and also like one might fit you better than the other. So it is really important to know what kind of impact those exclusivity has on your game, and then choose what is better fitting for you. So let's start with the originals. So originals is not really necessarily a type of exclusivity, but because it usually evolves into like these 3 forms of exclusivity, I just quickly want to cover it. So originals is basically the games that are made for that platform, right? So usually the platforms reach out to the studios a lot earlier on in the development, even on idea stage, and then they may be more involved into the development a lot earlier on. So for a PR coordination, or there might be some language implementation earlier on in their development stage, so you have to kind of count that workload that will be added into the development. In Apple Arcade, for example, is a great example. Since the platform is pretty young, like a lot of games that were already released on Apple Arcades were already in development, even already announced when Apple Arcade deal was in place. But you can see that there's a lot and younger titles joining Apple Arcade family. So after originals are done in development and are released, they usually evolve into one of these 3 kinds of exclusivity that I'm going to be covering from now on. So let's start with the full exclusivity. That's a very straightforward, the most common public understanding of exclusivity, right? So there will be, within one hardware platform, there will be one service provider, one service or one provider that will be providing this game. So it is super easy, super straightforward. But what makes it interesting is that there is a temporary exclusivity. So Epic, for example, has a timed exclusivity, usually a year. And then there was, for example, Discord used to do 3 months exclusivity. So other than exclusivity, there's also other different forms of release restrictions. For example, a subscription restriction is a very common one, also platform restriction. So subscription restriction is pretty straightforward. You're not allowed to join any subscription services, but the platform restriction is something that people don't really consider deeply when they're signing it. So there are some services that, like, after exclusivity is over, you can release your game on Xbox or PlayStation, but then you cannot, for example, release on Switch. But if your game is really a Switch game, like if it is a game that is really appealing to Switch crowds, then this is something that you really have to consider. So those are the restrictions that you have to really consider when you're signing a contract about exclusivity or release restrictions. So there are many factors to consider when you are signing in exclusivity deals, but the clearest upside is the financial return. So to compensate any release restrictions, most of the platforms that does exclusivity gives out a very significant amount of investment upfront when there's exclusivity deal in place. And those kind of fundings can be really like a way to save your studios, for example, and it can also secure budget for your localization, your porting, for example, and then it can also be a stepping stone for like showing your games to a lot bigger audience by hiring PR agencies and so on. So when these kind of deals come in place, I always congratulate all of our industry partners and friends, but there is a risk. So when the game becomes less accessible, it becomes a shocking factor for the fans, like who has been waiting for the game for a very long time. So especially for the games that has like a verbal and very dedicated community, there is a possibility that you will experience a very harsh backlash. Ooblet is like a very... Thank you. Ooblet is a very harsh example. So Ooblet is this really cutesy adventure farming kind of game. And then Epic exclusivity was announced quite recently. And then like when it was announced, the devs have to experience really harsh backlash, including death threats. But I'm not saying that you're gonna experience death threats whenever you sign an exclusivity. That's not what I'm saying. But when you are put into those kind of friction situation, there are a lot higher possibility of putting yourself in a harmful conversation that may harm your community or the brandings. So that's something that you have to really consider. Moving on to the second item, when people think about release timing of a project, they only think about the initial launch and also external factors. So people think about when you're going to be initially launching your game and also like holidays around it, or the big games that are in the similar genre releasing within the same similar timeline, right? But one thing that people often neglect is at which point of the life cycle of your game will be released on a new platform. Because realistically, it is almost impossible to prepare the game to be ready for all platforms all at the same time, right? So first phase is demo. So it is before launch. You have your art style and then game mechanics intact, and you really want to know what people think, but you don't want to spoil them too much. And you make the demo available for everyone. And it really is a great step to build a foundation of a community or the initial expectation for the game. And you have really a full control of like until when you want to show the fun. Also, for platform perspective, this is a really useful promotional tool because basically it's a playable content, it's interactive content that the devs and publishers gave the consent for distributing for free, right? So when you have a demo and like you want to use it as a promotional tool, like go to the platform and then like, kind of negotiate it as like a special perks, like this actually works. So for example, Steam Demo Day, Steam Game Awards, like people in platforms, they all called it like Steam Demo Day actually. But Steam Game Awards, for example, was very beneficial for many different publishers and developers because it really gave them an opportunity to reach the community milestone, for example. A lot of people got new wish listing. So, sorry. So this is something that you can really use in the conversation with the platforms in the earlier stage of the development. And the second phase of the release timing can be early access. Early access is all about expectation management, actually. Like people can be very verbal. They can be both generous and harsh. So like there can be people like who says like, oh, it is before full launch. So like you should be generous about this little flaw. Sometimes people say like this is a full launch, like why is it in this kind of state? So the key is people are very communicative, people are very verbal. So what is really important in this stage is that you have to make sure that people feel comfortable about like talking about something, and then they should be feel they are heard. So during early access phase, like the really important thing to consider when you're choosing a platform to launch is if they have a great community building potential. So either there is a great usage between users, great forum usage between the users, or the platform really encourages people to go out on Discord or your social media to talk about things. It's like a debutante for your game, right? There is the most media coverage, there's the most media attention to your game. So this is something that you can really use with the platform conversation, because platform really knows that like that's when the attention really goes into your game. So they are a lot more generous about giving out like internal exposure support, for example, getting featured and so on. Like Steam is a different story because they have a lot of games being dumped basically every single day. But then for smaller platforms like us or any other smaller game storefronts and so on, it is a lot easier for you to talk about like the additional internal exposure. And there is a lot of different scenarios after full launch how your game will be available for different platforms. But let's say there is this particular scenario of you want to launch it on the same hardware platform, let's say PC, but then different service. But then you don't want to do it on day one. Like you don't want to do it on the all same day. Like I just want to have like a 1 week term. So what you have to understand is that like usually in this case there is diluted media attention, and then the platforms also know about it. So like in this case, you have to remember that it is kind of hard for them to justify that any internal exposure as well. So in this case, it is a lot harder to do conversations about exposure support. So my advice is if you can, make it all on the same day. In the last part of the life cycle regarding the release timing will be the end of life cycle. So there are couple of cases that you would like to release your game at the end of life cycle. You already release it to the major platforms, but then like and now the sales is kind of going down, and you want to give it a new life in a new platform. So in that case, same with the last item, it is a little hard for the platform to give those kind of support, but then like you can give a little more storytelling to it. For example, there are many cases that people are doing, for example, a Game of the Year edition or a complete edition and so on. So this is kind of perks like when you're doing end of life cycle release, like if you give a proper storytelling, there is enough opportunities for the platforms to push it, basically. So in short, there are basically two different phases of life cycle. Life cycle that you have to consider when you are considering different release on different points of the life cycle of the game. Is first phase is when it is a demo or early access phase. That's when you have to really consider the community building potential. So like for demo as well, people need to be talking about how they feel about the game experience, and also they need to feel a bit more heard. This is great timing to build your community and also expectation. So go to the platform that has active forum usage, and also where they really promote your social media and a lot more. And the second phase of the life cycle would be after full release. That's when you need to think more about the storytelling of the game. Storytelling of the game release. You should really need those extra why of why there is this additional launch on a different platform. So, yeah. Moving on to the next item. So continuing the theme of storytelling, the slide is a bit hard to structure in the same way as the other slides, because exposure support not only differ per platform, but also really differs vastly per title. It is actually like the more you can get, the better. But so it is not really a choice compensate on another, but it really is a question of how you can get the most out of it. So in order to structure those conversation more beneficially for yourself, I think it is good to know that there are two different kinds of exposure support. So the first one is internal exposure, and the second one would be external exposure. So roughly when it is a big platform, internally they have a bigger pool of users to reach. It is not that they don't for external exposure, but they simply have more to bring when you get the internal exposure, even though it is a lot easier to get it compared to the external exposure. Doesn't that make sense? On the other hand, smaller platforms with smaller portfolio growth gives a lot more attention to one in each title. So as a result, there's more space for you to make more elaborate and extensive suggestions on PR coordination, especially for the external supports. So this also really makes you further your relationship with the platform, because you work a lot closely with them, like not only just like getting features simply, but also really going to events with them, and also like organizing something special with them. So as a tip for making this kind of situation of you getting more extra external exposure, it is really helpful when you give like something small back. For example, just like tell them that you can mention them on the trailer or press release, and it will be a lot easier for you to get the external exposure. So I have a good example from our own platform. So we have a really great relationship with Toge Production. It's an Indonesian developer slash publisher who is behind a lot of recent indie gems, including Coffee Talk that is recently released. We signed Coffee Talk about last year, June. So the release has been like delayed quite a couple of times, but actually it was very beneficial for both parties, because that really like made our conversation a lot more active, actually. So Toge Production was really active in making suggestions, and then like coming to us in social media and so on. So that really made us feel like it is really comfortable to work with them. So as a result, for August Gamescom, we made them as like a head title of our exhibition, and that really gave them actually a lot of, how do I say, benefit that is even outside of our platform. For example, they reached a huge milestone in their wish listing. And also we shoot some video contents for them. And then that was also hitting a lot of views, and then like was also shared by a lot of media as well. So this kind of building up this kind of relationship with platform is also really beneficial for you. It's kind of symbiotic a relationship. So if you give more, and also they can give you more. And so when you're in talks with platforms, especially for PR support, it is really important for you to speak up and then really try to be active in those conversations, because they're also people, and then they are also feeling more comfortable with people who comes to them and then talk to them. And the last item will be dev requirements. So this is also not really a comprehensive list. There's a lot more different topics, but I just brought two, SDK integration and localization requirements, because they're simply just the most common ones in the dev requirements. So some platforms needs a very extra and extensive dev time to integrate those SDKs into your game. Some platforms simply don't if you have any other builds. Some platform can only work with executables, for example. So this sounds like a one-way street, like the convenience, great, so like let's go for the most convenient one, but actually it's not, it's rather a double-sided sword. So for example, in our case, we do all the integration ourselves. So it's really convenient for our developers and publishers. However, it means you have to get your final build ready 2 to 3 weeks before the final release. Same as localization requirements. It's only to really bring your game to the broader outreach, right? However, when you need like 14 different languages integrated within like 3 months of time, like after signing, that takes a lot of time and budget as well. So do you have time and budget to accommodate that? It's also up to you. So most of these dev requirements sometimes are mostly not negotiable. So it's really important to know about it. Usually it comes up like naturally during the conversation with the platform, but it is really important to first ask like upfront, like what are the things that I need to do, like before it goes any deeper, basically. As promised, this is the more comprehensive list than the very first one. So let's just walk through things a little quickly once again. So we talked about exclusivity. Exclusivity is basically when the game is only available in certain provider or services within one hardware. And there is 2 different sides to consider when you consider exclusivity. First one is a financial return, but also it has a risk of putting yourself into a bit of a riskful and harmful conversation. And next one was release timing. There were 2 phases of life cycle that we have to consider differently. First one is early access and demo phase. That is when you need a platform that has better community building potential, that people can talk easily, and also you can also talk easily to people. And the second phase was after full release. That's when you have to really consider if there is a storytelling and PR value to this specific release in a new platform. And then we covered exposure support. There were 2 different types, internal and external supports. And depending on how the size of the platform is and how they operate, either one can be easier to get than the other one. Usually the smaller one is easier to get the exposure, external exposure. And in order to get that, you have to remember that it's a symbiotic relationship. So if you appeal that you can get something back, even if small, that makes the conversation a lot easier. And also you have to speak up, be active, because that really builds up the relationship to go further with this conversation. And lastly, there is dev requirements. A lot of dev requirements are only for furthering your quality and outreach of the titles, so it's only good. However, it is something that you would need to consider when you're budgeting your time and also your resources. So that's something that it is good to cover in the very earlier stage of the conversation. So we now covered all the checklist, but I think it would be a lot more helpful if I implemented actually in the actual conversational process. So I made the last slide to look like this. So this is a general process of how the conversation with platform goes. And some of the things that I already mentioned in the checklist can be useful in each stage. And let me walk you through this very quickly. So the first stage is introduction. It can be done in a many different ways. Firstly, at the events, like right now, we can make people and build a personal connection. Also, there is a way to do it digitally as well. A lot of platforms have a content submission form. Like even in bigger platforms, they have content submission form. Go there and then submit it. Also, it is not weird to approach people directly on LinkedIn or go through their team email and then emailing them in person as well. Just make sure that it reaches the right person. If you email a community manager, they might not reach the content acquisition person. So make sure to write an email to the right person. And if you do it in a digital medium, it is usually combined with the second step. So I'm going to cover it later. But when you are doing it in the events, the very essence of this stage is a quick appeal. So when there are so many things happening, devs are really busy, but also platform people, their goal today is to go through all the events and then look through all the contents, right? And then you can move on to the second phase after the event is over. Follow them up with a simple email like, hey, it was nice meeting you. We met at this event in this context. It is kind of nice to have a personal touch in there because then you get happy and then it is more prone to get reply. Usually after events, I get about 50, 60 emails and it's not a bias, but then I tend to email back more if that person is nice, So, so in this stage, basically, you will have to give out one of these 5 different things. Preferably a playable content, so make sure that either build demos or keys or vertical slices ready, because it's distribution phase. We're not publishers, but it's more of a further into those different phases of game releases. So make sure that one of those playable contents are ready. When the playable content is going through curation of the platform, you also have time to assess if the platform is suitable for you or not. And in order to do that, please request the platform of their deck or a better standard contract. Since they work with hundreds of publishers and developers, they always have a standard agreement, standard contract. It is really easy to just request and they will just send it out to you. So consider, look through all the contracts and then see if those deals are better, are well fitting for you. And also during this stage, basically, focus on why this game will be successful in their platform. Because the next stage is when you have to discuss about more practical stuff like monetization plans and also legal terms or other requirements and also PR coordination and everything. And in this stage, if you can really appeal and then start the conversation with the higher notes about your game, then you really ease yourself into those later stages of the conversation. And moving on to the third one, this is when the checklist will become the most handy, I guess. This is when you talk about more practical stuff like monetizations and legal and other requirements. During this stage, I just want to say, please remember to negotiate. I'm not saying you have to play hard, but I'm just saying you have to be very active. Negotiation is a action of arriving in the best deal for everyone. It can be creative, it can be normal and classic, but then it is really important to communicate and what you want and what kind of situation you are and what you can benefit and what you can offer as well. And usually the next step, the release prep, comes after the contract is signing. A lot of people believe that that's when the conversation ceases, but actually it's not. That's the time that you really have to keep the active conversation going. Usually the things that are happening during this phase is either technical integration and the PR coordination. So for this phase, I really want to tell you, be communicative. If there is any tech issues, or there is any change in release plan, the platform has to be informed. You work together, and it is
especially when you're self-publishing, you're managing a lot of different things. So I understand when people forget about informing their platforms, and then they think it will be fine. But actually, it's a lot more convenient for everyone when people know that there is certain issues and that might cause a delay. And also for PR coordination specifically, be more creative. Suggestions and requests are always welcomed. A lot of platform, the people that we meet at events, from other platforms like PlayStation, Nintendo, and so on, they say they would like to have more active partners and active conversation, So be creative, go up to them, speak to them, and it's really helpful for you to keep this friendly, personal, active conversation and active communication going with them. So go get them. That's it. Thank you.